Today's episode is brought to you by the University of Hawaii, College of Tropical Ag and Human Resources, and the Livestock Extension Group.
Aloha, welcome to Livestock Wala'au, a podcast aimed to provide educational support, information, guidance, and outreach to our livestock stakeholders in Hawaii. We are your hosts, Mele Osho
and Shannon Sand.
Today, we're going to discuss best management practices in beekeeping in Hawaii.
To do that, we're going to introduce you to the pollinator ecologist for the University of Hawaii, Dr. Christina Mogren.
So I'm excited to introduce you to our colleague, Dr. Mogren, who researches the effects of nutrition and dietary diversity on the health of honeybees in an emerging field known as conservation physiology. So let's let Chrissy tell us more about how she came to be the specialist for this in the University of Hawaii.
Good morning, ladies. Thank you so much for inviting me onto your podcast. I'm so excited to be talking about bees with everyone today.
Yeah. Thank you for coming.
Yeah. So my path to bees is not a particularly exciting one. So I was listening to some of your previous podcasts. Dr. Odani had this amazing, I love kittens, want to play with kittens all day. I kind of never felt like that about bees. But here I feel that way about puppies, but here I am working with bees. I guess they're both fuzzy. No, I got my PhD actually in aquatic entomology with an emphasis on pollution. So I was really interested in natural resources management when I first started my post-undergraduate education. But it was my first job afterwards. I got a postdoctoral position with the USDA in South Dakota. And that was looking at the effects of pesticides on honeybees. And so that was kind of with my first job that I transitioned into working in those kinds of systems. So still working with a toxin, in this case, pesticides or toxic substance, just looking at it in a very different context. So after that, I moved to the Louisiana State University Ag Center in Baton Rouge, where I continued working with folks from the USDA at the lab that they have also in Baton Rouge in collaboration through the university, before getting the position out here in Hawaii. And now I'm the pollinator ecologist at UH Manoa. I'm an assistant specialist. So I have a large extension component to my position and then also research, and have been here for almost 4 years.
Yay! Nice. We're happy to have you. I love honey, so I'm very happy.
Yeah. And I was fortunate enough to work with you when you did the workshop here on the Big Island, and I learned so much. And so the USDA now recognizes bees as livestock, correct?
They do. And I think a lot of beekeepers even don't necessarily think of honeybees as livestock, but really they are, right? If you think about it, they're a highly domesticated species. All right, there's a number of different honeybee species, like true species. So when we talk about honeybees, what we're actually referring to when we say that word, what we really mean are the European or Western honeybee, which is Apis mellifera. So there are other species of honeybees like Apis cerana, Apis florea, which are from Asia. But the one we are talking about, the one that's been introduced all over the world, is the European honeybee, which is native to Northern Africa and Europe, and then also Far Eastern Asia. So that's the species that we move all over the place. So there's a number of different races or subspecies, as they're referred to, and it's been various breeding programs throughout the millennia that have given us the honeybee that we have today. The genetics are highly regulated by a number of different breeding groups to make sure that we're getting the best available honeybees. So if you go out and you purchase a queen, you're getting a queen who is, the product of, just generations of breeding programs to get you her progeny, who are going to be easy to work with. So they're not going to sting you. They're going to be really great honey producers. They're going to have the capability to groom different parasites off of themselves to reduce potential pesticide, burdens later on. And then potentially also be somewhat resistant to different diseases that honeybees unfortunately have to contend with. So, it's just like cattle. You don't think about it, but it's just like cattle. It's just like a breeding program to get a cow that's really great at making milk versus one that's really great for beef.
People don't really realize that, several years ago, because I worked in South Dakota for South Dakota State University for 5-6 years, I guess, before I came to Hawaii, actually. So, but I was I went to a conference and they talked about the bee breeding, and it is very intense in
Mhm.
terms of like the like keeping track of like the genetics and like you said the breeding, and I was like amazed. I was like, wow,
Yeah.
it's
Yeah,
It's
when I first
amazing.
started too, as a tech in the Waimea office, there was another technician there that was working with a lot of the bee programs. And that's where, I just started to open my eyes about different things that was going on and whatnot with them. And then I remember her receiving a little queen. And I was like, what do you mean there's a bee in there? She's like, yeah, it's a queen. I was like, oh my gosh. And, it was just kind of cool because I never, you never really thought about it. And then later on, now I hear that they were considered USDA recognized them as livestock, which makes sense with a lot of the management practices that you do for the honey, for the queens and whatnot. It's similar, you want those genetics to be passed down into your flock or your herd and whatnot. It's the same thing with your hive. What is it called? Group of bees? Is it a colony?
colony.
Okay.
It's a colony.
Swarming, you don't want them to do that.
Swarm is not a good word, I guess.
A swarm, swarm refers to something else. It's not like a murder of crows, like a murder of bees. Like some words just don't go hand in hand well, right?
Swarm just has like a really negative connotation, but
Like,
because I follow a couple of beekeepers online, and they will like when like bees colonize out in the wild, like let's say under somebody's like shade umbrella in the backyard. I was like, I've seen her go in, and I'm like really surprised at how calm bees are, or she is. I guess she just scoops them right up and puts them in the new little house and stuff, and just makes sure. Like she checks them for like mites and different like pests and stuff.
That's a good point, because there's a couple of folks that do that, I think, on the different islands. Yeah. Chrissy, are you familiar with them? Like, I mean, that's something that some people should know that, I mean, it's important if you have a colony that
don't kill them.
Don't kill them. The people, there are people out there who will come and remove them for you.
Absolutely. So the word swarm has come up. So a swarm of honeybees, right? That's a natural, it's a word with a negative connotation, but it's a natural part of honeybee biology. So it's not just about the individual bee. Really, an individual bee, you should think of like a cell inside of a larger organism, and that organism is the colony. So if I get mad and I step on one bee, it's okay. Because unless that bee's the queen, like the rest of the colony is going to be just fine, right? So when that colony, though, gets too big for its space, it's going to swarm, right? And so that's another form of reproduction. So it's not just the queen laying eggs, but it's the colony swarming. And so it splits. The old queen's going to leave with some of the workers, and they're going to go fly someplace. And from that location, kind of scout out and try to find a new place to set up a new colony. So it's a natural part of their biology. It's one beekeepers want to avoid, right? Because potentially you just lost half the bees. And so what you want to do then is, intercept that swarm, put them in boxes, you're managing them properly, and then those can go on to be another super productive colony in your operation. And the reason why the swarm is going to be so passive like that, right? They don't really have anything to defend. So in the middle of that swarm is going to be the queen. So you can literally just go in with your hand very gently. As long as you can get the queen, she produces a pheromone, and the other workers can be like, oh, her pheromone, and then they're going to cluster around that, be like, oh, stay near the queen. So if you just gently go in there and move the queen, like all the other bees, even if you just pluck out the queen and put her on your hand and keep it near them, they're going to all walk on, right? That's how you get people with the bee beard, the bee bras. Like that's how you do that, right?
The bee bra, but like it was definitely like all
cool.
of her hand, and it was really, really cool to watch. So, and I think this was actually a colony. I don't know if it was a split and the queen didn't go with this one or it died, but like, and luckily like I said, it was a lady. I was like, and she actually carried a queen with her just in case. And so she was waiting, and it was like a whole process to see if like they accepted the queen, and it was so neat. I was like amazed, and I was just like, cool.
Yeah, well, you think about the queen, like, oh, it's good to be queen. Again, it's another word that has a connotation. It's not so great to be the queen. Like literally, you get to leave the colony once in your entire life, right? Unless you swarm. You leave once, you mate with as many dudes as you can, because they store the sperm. They're storing that she only mates once in her life. They can mate with up to 30 males, and they store all of that sperm. And that's the sperm that they will have for the remainder of their lives, living inside the colony and laying their eggs. The reason they have to store the sperm, so 99.9% of all the bees inside are females. They're all sisters to each other. They're all daughters of the same queen. If she fertilizes an egg, that egg develops into a female, which is what you want, right? Because those are the ones that do all the work. If she chooses to not fertilize that egg, it will still develop, but it'll develop into a male who's also called a drone. So the drones don't do anything. Their sole purpose is to mate and die. And if it gets to be a certain time of year and there's too many drones inside, it's like, winter's coming on, we're done with you. They'll kick them out, and then they don't mate, and then they're going to die because they'll starve to death. They can't even feed themselves. They're really sweet and they're fuzzy. They look like little teddy bears. They cannot sting you. But they're kind of worthless. I mean, they don't do anything. So the sisters will just kick them out because they just beg for food and don't help out. So but yes, that's why it's so important, right? And so there's a number of reasons why a queen may be rejected. So maybe she's old and the pheromone she produces to make everyone like her, just kind of starts, it's not that strong anymore. So if that's the case, the workers are going to make a new queen. And when that queen emerges, she's going to kill the old one. If she is not mated properly and isn't, laying enough eggs, well, they'll replace her. If she runs out of sperm and is only laying drones, obviously that's not a good thing because she's got a bunch of males not doing anything, they'll replace her. So, I mean, lots of things can go wrong when you're the queen, it's like you're walking a very fine line to keep everybody else happy because they'll just replace you.
Wow, that's amazing.
Wow. So there's a little bit, I guess Shannon and I talked a little bit about the history, I guess, of beekeeping in Hawaii, right? Because it's been here for a long time. I don't think people really know how long bees have had, but
I mean, I don't know that much about the history of beekeeping in Hawaii. I know I was on the judging panel for the taste testing for Big Island bees, which I happily enjoyed. I love food, so I'm not gonna lie. But I was like, can you give us some of the history of like beekeeping in the state of Hawaii? Is that
Absolutely. A lot of people, they think they see wild bees and they call them wild bees, right? Well, they're not. There's no such thing as a wild bee. It's a feral colony. It's just like a goat on the Big Island that you don't want to get on the highway. Like that got loose from somewhere. That's not a wild goat. That's a feral goat. It's the same thing with honeybees. They're not wild. They're not supposed to be here. They were introduced in around the 1850s, so mid 1800s. And the reason they were introduced, obviously, is for honey production. They had a couple of failed attempts bringing them over from California because obviously that's a long boat ride, keeping them alive and happy. But they finally did establish, and they were actually instrumental in helping the cattle industry take off. So Kiave was an introduced plant again, right? We think all these things that were so common in the landscape now, they kind of were they've only been here,
introduced in a way, introduced,
A lot of things have been introduced and are now naturalized. And, Kiave is one of those plants. And so they introduced Kiave as, the pods as fodder for the cattle, and then needed to be pollinated by something because prior to honeybees being here, you didn't have any social insect pollinators, period. We do have some native bees. You don't really see them. Well, you're not going to see them in agricultural areas or, home gardens because they've got real close associations with native Hawaiian plants. So you see those now because you've got so much construction and development, along the coast, where you're mostly going to see them now is at higher elevations. It's been truly remnant, native Hawaiian plant habitats. So for better or worse, we don't see our native yellow-faced bees as often, though there's still populations you can see in coastal areas and stuff. But, it's these introduced bees that are so important for pollination services in the way that we think about them. So that's kind of how it got started here. So that's why they were introduced. At one point, Molokai was the world's largest producer of honey. It's incredible, right? That was the 1920s. They're like, well, what were they making honey from? Sugarcane, right? You got the exudates from the sugarcane. Like they'll go, they're opportunistic foragers. That's the sugar water. That's all nectar is, right? So they turn that into honey. Unfortunately, that industry completely collapsed. The honey industry collapsed as a result of foul brood, American foul brood, which is a really bad bacterial disease. It was accidentally introduced into the state and completely decimated the beekeeping industry. And honestly, it's something that's never really recovered. So we kept getting these, resurgent outbreaks every 20 years or so. And it was happening statewide. And so, you'd see like the number of colonies being kept would increase, and then they'd have a sudden decline, probably because of resurgence of disease. They finally started getting this, better, probably around like the 80s, 90s. It kind of started taking off again, and then mid 2000s, we had the introduction of Varroa mites. So it's an external parasite. If you think about parasites and the size of the parasite to its host, it is the largest parasite compared to the size of its host of any parasitic relationship in the world that we know of, right? So it's the equivalent of like a dinner plate sucking me dry. That's how big they are,
That's what I'm thinking about.
They are. Plate, And we actually got to see one of them on the bees in the workshop when we were doing the workshop. There was one that was actually on the bees. So
Yeah, they're big
Yeah.
compared to the size of the host. And, you know, they feed, you know, for a long time, we thought that they sucked the blood of the honeybees. It's not actually what they're doing. They suck the fat body, which is the equivalent of their liver. You're like, wow, thanks, right?
Yeah, that's
So honeybees, they don't have the same organs that we do, but they have, you know, organs that take on a number of functions. So it's the fat, you know, for us, that's a storage organ. For them, it also is, but then it also serves in kind of detoxification and other functions that our liver would also play in our bodies. So it, you know, kind of feeds from the outside in and kind of sucks out all the nutrients from their fat. And then it also turns around and transmits a number of viruses. And viruses are the really bad things. There's no way to control a virus. There's no way to treat a virus in honeybees. All you can do is control the vector, which is the Varroa mite. So that's kind of the history of beekeeping on Hawaii in a nutshell. Started out great. It's kind of, had a lot of some issues.
Is it still a pretty large honey producer? I mean, I'm just curious. Do you know if they
worldwide, no. You know, I mean, relatively speaking, honey accounts for a pretty small sliver of the agricultural economy in Hawaii. But that being said, we can produce specialty honeys that nowhere else in the world you can get. And so that's
a lot of them
incredible,
because I use I use them in baking. So if you've had cookies or bread from me, it's probably got one of those in it. So yes,
some good Hawaiian honey,
Florida
right?
Honey.
I mean, you can get. Well, and that's the thing. So our honeys, the flavor profile is totally different. So on the mainland, you get a lot of clover honey, especially in the Great Plains. You know, we were talking about Texas and the heat wave before we came on, right? So Texas all the way up to the Dakotas, you get a lot of clover honey. And that's the majority of honey in the country. That's where it's produced and that's what it's comprised of. And so it has a very distinct, it's very light, very sweet. So ours, you know, has some different profiles. I think sometimes can be kind of bitter. If you get coffee honey, so honey produced from bees visiting coffee flowers, I think it tastes a bit like butterscotch. I think it's really good. So just it's interesting. Like we can get some of these, you know, pure, you know, flower things. And, you know, Ohia Lehua Kiave honey is some of the most expensive honey in the world. So you can charge like $20 a pound, you know, in comparison to clover honey.
Yeah. So I just love honey. So I think it's because again, where I grew up, like we have a lot of specialty honey. So I'm like, oh yeah.
I've got a honey shelf in my pantry. Yeah. And then I, you know, was in Germany and then Serbia a few years ago. And so I'm like, might as well get some German honey. Might as well get some Serbian honey. So I've got, it's an international exotic honey collection.
So there's so much stuff, I think, to learn about management. So what are some of the management practices, I guess, that is important for beekeeping? And so if somebody wanted to start something in Hawaii, or, you know, what's the tips that you could give them in starting?
Well, so the two big things that I guess there's three big things that I've kind of already mentioned that absolutely everyone should keep in mind, or let's say four. One, right? They're not wild animals. They are livestock. And you would not, just like you wouldn't let a cow starve, you should not let your bees starve. You know, you should not take a hands-off approach to beekeeping. They need to be managed because they are a domesticated animal. I said four. Let's see if I can think of them. So I mentioned Varroa mites, you know, Varroa mites, you know, they're something that have to be managed. Now, we have really strict import-export laws. We're mostly import laws in the state. So the only live bee product that's allowed to be brought into the state is honeybee semen. You have to remove the semen from the male bees and you can import that because we have some amazing breeding programs on the Big Island. The Big Island is actually the world's largest exporter of queens for sale. I know, pretty incredible. So that's a product that is allowed to be brought in for the purposes of supporting that industry and keeping our genetics good. But aside from that, you cannot bring used beekeeping equipment into the state, and you cannot move any live bee products or beekeeping equipment between the islands. We only have the mite on Big Island and Oahu. So we want to keep it that way for as long as possible. But Molokai, Lanai, Maui and Kauai are all Varroa free. So the beekeepers there, yay, for now at least, you know, I still think they should be monitoring, you know, every month, every 2 months, just to make sure. But for now, anytime that it has popped up accidentally, they've been able to eradicate it. So that's been great. The third thing that I mentioned was the Falibro diseases. So there's two different types of foul brood. They're both caused by different pathogenic agents. You've got American foul brood and European foul brood. And I actually just recently responded to, but I'm going to use the word outbreak, right? So outbreak doesn't mean like it's been widespread. Outbreak can occur on any scale. So this was an outbreak in a single operation. This operation was very well maintained. So the thing with foul brood is that it's incredibly pathogenic. It spreads so easily and so quickly within an operation. And then it can really easily spread to neighboring operations as well. So it's important to just monitor and know when something is off. This particular beekeeper knew something was off because it didn't smell right. That was the first indication that something was off. And the reason foul brood is something that can be so damaging right now is that many beekeepers, especially new beekeepers, have no experience with it. You hear about it, you read in the textbook. This is my first time ever seeing it in the field too, right? And I researched bees, and I have done for 8 years now, and I've never seen it in the field. So, knowing when something is off is really important, and being able to diagnose what that is. Because European foul brood, that's a pretty simple fix, right? It probably happened because you don't have a good nectar flow. So you go inside, your bees, the babies look kind of hungry. They're not pearly white. They're not swimming in a bunch of goo, which is what they eat. So that's a bad sign. You don't maybe see a ton of nectar or honey, stored on the side of the combs. So if you see those conditions, and something kind of smells sour, and we were kind of like, what's that smell like to you? Like, sweaty socks. I mean, like, we're trying to figure like, whose turn? All right, smell this one. What do you think it smells like? Come up with a word for that. But to us in that moment, this particular infestation, it smelled like dirty socks, like to me, kind of like vinegary, nasty, sweaty socks. It was bad. But it was like, okay, that's what we're smelling right now. And that's because of all these other co-infections that occur with European foul brood. But to get over that, what you do is you feed them with sugar water. So that's number 4. If your bees are hungry, feed them. A lot of people don't want to. They'll think we live in Hawaii, it's lush. Well, just because it's lush doesn't mean there's flowers. And just because there's flowers does not mean that they provide nectar or pollen resources in the quantities or in the ratios that honeybees need for their own survival.
Have droughts like Hawaii County. I mean, I don't know about when this actually comes out, but
it just came out.
Yeah, we are currently in a drought in Hawaii County. So, I mean, we get in a drought too. You have to feed, just like you have to feed your livestock. If there's no grass, you have to feed your babies.
Well, that's interesting because I guess I always, figured, there's flowers around. That's always going to make sure that there's food for them because there's flowers or there's, there's something, but I guess I never really, imagined that.
It sounds like not all of the native ones are like,
I guess, and it's similar to cattle. Just because there's grass and it's green in there, it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to provide them the nutrition that they need. Right. So I guess with bees.
Right. Their protein requirements are very specific. They're specific, right? Yeah. If they're breeding, if they've got, babies or whatever, they have their very specific needs. And for honeybees, it's the exact same thing. And I would also say for honeybees, they can starve if it's raining. So we had that flooding, a few years back, and it really affected like Waimanalo and Kauai. The bees were also starving in those locations then, because anything that puts off plant phenology, if it's raining too hard, plants are like, I'm not going to make flowers right now. And when it's raining, like a bee's pretty small. If you've got a torrential downpour, you can't fly in that. So I mean, it kind of can go both ways. And so it's monitoring year round. It's all people ask me, when's it an issue? Like, when should I look for that? I'm like, well, you should be in your hives, at least once a month, and you should know just by looking, right? And then supplement is needed. You can purchase pollen substitutes, or if you want, you can collect pollen. Yeah, it's like a protein supplement that you can purchase from beekeeping suppliers. Yeah, and so you can mix that up and feed that to them, or if you want, you can put up a pollen trap and collect your own local pollen and just keep that in the freezer, and that'll stay frozen for about a year and still be highly nutritious. Mix that with a little bit of water. You can make like a little hamburger. You just put that on a piece of wax paper and set that on the top bars in your colony, put the lid back on, and the bees will eat that and kind of, bring that back down. So you can do either. I think either are perfectly fine. Even a commercial substitute is much easier, right? You don't necessarily have to buy a pollen trap and then be like, the pollen beetles got into my pollen trap. I mean, there's so many things that, can go wrong when you do it yourself. So you can avoid the hassle by just purchasing a product, and that is absolutely fine as well. So it'll get you through these dearth periods. And so you shouldn't feel bad about having to do that.
That is so interesting.
I know, I'm just like, keep talking. This is exciting. I'm learning a lot.
Okay.
I really enjoyed this.
It's funny. I've just never even thought that, you have to supplement them. I just kind of
makes
always
sense though. Yeah, I didn't think that either. I was like, there's flowers everywhere. But I'm like, that makes total sense. Cause like,
that's funny. Very good.
Well, here's another kicker for you, right? What do honeybees pollinate in Hawaii? And we think about, they're so great. They pollinate, they go to the flowers. Well, do they, right? So you think about native pollination systems in Hawaii. Well, honeybees were introduced in the 1850s. Our plants that are native here did not evolve with a social, we refer to as a social hymenopteron, you know, something like a honeybee or a bumblebee. Like they recruit to resources. So it's a very specific type of pollination syndrome that's pollinated by these type of social bees. We never had that here. It was birds and beetles, and then also flies. Those were our big native pollinators. And of course, again, we have our native yellow-faced bees. So, you know, a lot of the flowers here, especially many of them that are bird pollinated, the nectar ratio isn't what a honeybee needs. So they may not even visit those flowers, right? But in some cases, right, so the ohia, the hua, like they're pollinated by EEV. The EEV are declining for a number of reasons, unfortunately. But we also know that honeybees can, that's a species, a native one that they can pollinate, that they can visit. Obviously, they make wonderful honey from it. But so that's kind of a nice example of how in the absence of a native pollinator, this introduced pollinator could potentially at least continue propagating a very culturally and ecologically significant plant here in the state. But aside from, you know, a few notable examples, we also know that they visit a number of weeds. So plants that have been introduced here accidentally or not, that they'll also visit those. So they can play both a positive and a negative role when it comes to plant propagation from a pollination perspective. So that's unfortunately not something we have a great grasp on in the state as far as what it is they visit. And we have a few big ones that we know they do, but what about all these other ones? And we just don't know. And so that's also an area of my research that my students are working on, is trying to identify the plant species. And that can be really important because maybe there are native plants they're visiting. Well, that's a good thing to know for home gardeners, especially, right? So we can focus on propagating plant species for bees that are good for them, but that may also have, you know, important cultural, ecological significance locally. And, you know, sometimes they're used in lei making. They can be used in traditional medicine. They could be edible, you know, who knows, right? And there's just all these, it's important to think about conservation from under a much larger umbrella, and that you can conserve heritage and culture just as much as you can species, whether or not they're meant to be here.
Cool. Yeah, that's so much. I just feel like, wow. Yeah, that's pretty cool. I just, it's so much. I'm just like trying to absorb everything.
I know,
you're
like
saying
I'm taking it in. I'm like,
yeah, it was pretty eye opening though, I think. And the history and the parasites that have impacted the hives and the colonies and the industry here in Hawaii is very interesting. And I think that's important for people to understand and recognize when they're first starting their own colonies, right? So that they don't. So you talk about the Falibro. I guess I have a question for you. So where did it come from? I mean, it showed up in their colony, but where exactly is it coming from? Just the environment outside? I mean, how is it getting into hives?
Or is it like one of those things like where it could be on your shoe and you're walking around and so you never know?
Is there like, I guess my point is like, what's the biosecurity that people should be worried about in their own, their own colony, so that they don't bring things in or take things out, right?
So, okay, so I talked about European. All right, let me just take one step back. I'll talk American Falibro, because that's the one that's really, really bad. European, right, we can get over, just with nectar. American Falibro, if you find one larva, we call it Falibro because it affects the larvae or the babies, the brood. If you got one larva in your colony and that larva is positive for American Falibro, your entire colony is positive, the only thing you can do is burn it. Because it is the spores, the bacterial spores are that virulent and that persistent. We know that the spores can survive at least 80 years. And so that's how it pops up, right? So if, uncle stopped keeping bees 30 years ago and we don't really know why, but he left all of his stuff in the shed, and then you decide, I want to be a beekeeper. I'm going to use all this stuff. It's fine. It's just sitting there. Well, if he lost all of his bees because of foul brood, those spores are still active inside all of that beekeeping equipment. So if you're a new beekeeper, it's just start new. Start with, at the very least, you have to get all new frames. The hive bodies themselves, I mean, it's expensive. Like I know how expensive it is because we don't make it local. It's not a cheap hobby or a cheap, I mean, just like anything else in agriculture, like it's not necessarily cheap to get started. But the hive bodies, you can burn the inside as long as you scorch them really, really well. You can reuse a hive body that will kill the spores, but you should always replace your frames And as a beekeeper, for certain hygienic practices, you should maybe on a 5-year schedule, rotate out your frames. Like every 5 years or so, figure out whatever your rotational schedule is and just throw those frames away, but burn them. Get a burn permit, burn them. So be safe about burning them, especially if there's a drought. So, that's like one thing, but for American foul brood, so in this particular instance, it was American and European. It was a co-infection that was occurring in the same colonies, which made it kind of difficult. Like, what are we looking at here? It doesn't smell like the textbook says. The symptoms are all over the place from what the textbook says. And the reason is because we had both. So if you smell something off, step one, diagnose it. European isn't that big of a deal. American, super big deal. You have to burn it. So then what you also need to do is inspect all the other colonies in your apiary. So what you should be doing is use a different hive tool every time you enter a different, once you know an apiary is diseased, you have to use a different hive tool. That's how it'll spread on your hive tool. It's in the propolis, right? At the very least, what you need to be doing is between colonies with your hive tool, burn off all of the propolis. So take a blowtorch out in the field with you, burn it. And then you also want to wipe that down with a 10% bleach solution before then using that same tool to go into the next colony. Once you've recognized you have disease, you should also use disposable gloves. So the beekeeping gloves, we don't necessarily want to get stung. Some people can go in without. If you are on any of the outer islands, you can't. Your bees are simply not friendly enough. They don't have enough inflow of different genes. They're nasty to work with. So depending on the day, right? But I mean, they can be real. You kind of want to step on some of them on days like that, but they will sting you up pretty badly. So you do need to wear gloves, but disposable gloves, they can sting through them, but they don't recognize it. It's a weird texture. They don't think of it as something to sting. So disposable, gloves, keep those on hand. And you want to change those between every colony. So if you've diagnosed foul brood, that particular colony has to be burned. Then you need to inspect every single other colony in the apiary. If they're symptomatic, burn them. If they're not symptomatic, what you need to do is keep them clustered together, monitor them for symptoms, but what you also then need to do is treat them with antibiotics. So to acquire an antibiotic, you do have to go through a licensed veterinarian. There are some different antibiotic treatments. That would be my recommendation. Some operations, like if they're certified organic, that may not be an option for them, in which case I would say just keep them isolated at that location. Do not mix colonies. Do not move them. Keep them in that one place. And if you've got other colonies or other apiaries nearby, maybe move them, away if you can from that particular location and monitor. So as soon as they become symptomatic, they have to be burned. You cannot harvest the honey because then you're potentially contaminating honey extraction equipment with spores. I mean, it's that bad, right? And the good news is that we don't see it overly frequently. At least we don't think, because it's not, these are not statistics that the state keeps. But, it's hard. Some people like to try a shook swarm where they'll take the adult bees, they'll shake them into new equipment. And then you still have to burn all the old stuff. You have to burn the babies and all of that. And so they think if they can shake them, that'll be okay. If you do that, you should be treating them with antibiotics and still monitor, but the likelihood is that you have shaken, they ingested some honey. There's spores in the honey. Yeah, in that they've ingested, they're going to be shook. They're going to regurgitate that honey. And now, that's the spores are now in your new equipment, and your bees are still positive for it. So, and it's something to keep in mind though. And I know it's easy to say, why wouldn't you just burn it from a biosecurity standpoint? But again, with the exception, I mean, but the thing is, getting bees in Hawaii is also really hard to do. Like on Molokai, and even some areas of Kauai, your only option is to catch a swarm if you want to keep bees. You can't just go buy a package. That's really hard to do here. It's not like we can't mail them in from other places. Like you can anywhere on the mainland. If you live in Florida, you can go buy bees from California, not a problem. We can't do that here. So, it's understandable that, especially if an operation's been hit, you want to save your bees as much as you can, because it's really hard to get more to replace the ones that you've lost. But I would just, from a hygienic standpoint, once it spreads so quickly. And then once a colony becomes weak, they're opportunistic, right? Your neighbor's bees be like, oh, check it out. They're not doing so hot over here. They got a lot of honey in there. They're going to rob, right? They're going to get in there. They're going to rob. And now they're going to take those spores to a healthy colony. And that's how it can spread. Now, why it pops up in a particular location, we don't necessarily know. Maybe there are feral colonies that are harboring this that we don't know about because they're not managed. People get excited sometimes when they see the feral bees out there, but the reality is if they're not managed, they're harboring disease. They are. So, that's how it can be introduced. But so that's a particularly nasty one. It's something that should be on everyone's radar, but it's also not going to happen that frequently. It's not going to pop up all the time. And that's why eradication, when it does happen, is so important, because it's good stewardship for your practice, but really importantly for your neighbors. So
you diagnosis for the Falibro, is it just through the visual and smell of it, or is there actually a test that you run to diagnose?
Both. Yeah, so there's both. So you can smell it. You may be able to smell it. The thing is, if it's an early infection, you may not be able to, but your larvae are going to be kind of gross looking. They're going to turn brown. They're going to get soupy. If it's American Falibro, if you take a stick and once it's brown and you kind of swirl it and you pull it out, it's going to come out about 2 inches. It's going to make a string. If it pops back and you can't make it to make a string, well, then you got European Falibro, which is bad, but also good, right? Yeah, you don't have to burn it. If it comes out 2 inches, that's positive. That's the only thing in the world that will do that is American Falibro. So another thing you can do, you can buy these kits again from a beekeeping supply company, and it's kind of like a pregnancy test. And just having a couple on hand, like sometimes they'll put an expiration date on there. They're like $16 a piece. They're not cheap, and that'll give you one test. So you can keep them in the refrigerator as well, and that'll expand their shelf life. It's not like you're using this to diagnose a human health issue, so it's not as big of a deal if it's expired, right? It's okay. Just use it. But what you will never get, it's like a pregnancy test. You will never get a false positive. You can get a false negative. So you don't want to pick like, oh no, is this healthy looking larva infected? It doesn't matter. You want to find the nastiest looking larva inside the colony, right? Because when larva's infected, the whole colony is infected. So you want the nastiest looking one, and that's the one that you want to test. So if that nasty one is negative, you're like, okay, well, it's not American Falibro. It could be something else. But there's separate kits for American and European Falibro. So also make sure you don't mix them up. But just having a few of those on hand, is always great. Like I said, using beekeeping gloves, the spores can spread between your colonies with your gloves. So just make sure that you're regularly laundering your bee gloves, but then also your bee suit. You don't have to go full on hazmat, every single time, but just make sure that you are washing your bee suit after you visited a sick colony or a sick apiary. If you have an apiary that's diseased, visit your healthy one first and then go into your diseased one, so save that for last. So just to kind of, again, as much as possible, minimize the movement of spores. And if you, really want to be good too, it's not something beekeepers usually think about, but disinfecting your boots as well between an unhealthy and a healthy apiary. So it's kind of the same thing you would do for cattle, right? And most beekeepers, like these types of hygienic practices, you just don't do them. It's not, because again, foul brood isn't overly common. And so when it happens, it's kind of just a panic. Oh God, what do I do? I don't want to like overly scare people about this either. Like that should not be the reason you don't get into beekeeping. But definitely be aware that it exists, and we have it on all of the islands in the state. And actually, the records that have been kept since 2012, the majority of it exists on the Big Island. I think that may just be because there's more beekeepers on the Big Island. So it's
the most part, isn't it?
Yeah.
So,
yeah. So it's not because the Big Island, has more. I think there's just more beekeepers and so more opportunity to observe it. Yeah.
Oh, wow. And I know you can also test for the Varroa Mite as well, right? To do monitoring.
That's an easy test. Yes. So there's 2 different tests that work well. One of them, you will 100% kill the bees. The other one, you'll probably kill a lot of the bees. But some people still, they want to save every single one of their bees, right? So what I recommend is an alcohol wash, because that way you cannot screw it up. Like you will figure out your percentage mite infestation. So there's YouTube videos on this, but you just get a special shaker. You can modify a mason jar with like a mesh screen on top. Make sure that you get the correct size though, so that the mites can pass through it. But you'll dump a half a cup of bees. You want to make sure you're taking those from the brood chamber. So the Varroa mite reproduces on the pupae. Like that's what it's doing, is when a cell's been capped so the baby can undergo pupation, that's when the mites kind of jump in. So they're going to be on the nurse bees who are tending to that part of the colony. So you want to collect your nurse bees, half a cup, they go into a jar, add enough alcohol to cover them and shake them really good. And then you're going to kind of dump all that alcohol out. The mites are going to knock off, and then you can count the mites. So a half a cup of bees is about 300 bees. So you want to find out your percent infestation. You'll count how many mites you got in there. It's like, I found 12. Cool. You divide that by 3. Your percent infestation is 4%. Now, another option is to do a sugar roll. And a sugar roll, you'll again take your half a cup of scoop of bees, but instead what you're going to do is put in a bunch of powdered sugar. Then this one's a bit trickier because you want to make sure, when you get your bees, they're not somehow covered in honey. God, everything is sticky inside of a colony. It's very easy. Yeah. Like just the honey goes everywhere. You want the bees to be dry. So when you put in the powdered sugar, it doesn't just stick to them, right? And then you're going to set that in the shade. And you're going to let the bees sit in the shade. So the way that this particular method works is the powdered sugar brings up the bees' temperature. And it's that temperature change that causes the mites to fall off. Because like, I can't live on this. It got too hot. So then the mites just kind of drop off on their own. But you still then need to shake the bees really hard. And that action of shaking them is probably going to kill a lot of them, or at least knock their heads around. But at the end of it, your bees are still kind of alive and you can pour them back into your colony. And then their sisters, they're covered in sugar and their sisters are just kind of lick all the sugar off. But it's a lot easier to screw that method up. But if it's done correctly, it'll get you the same mite count as the alcohol wash. So that's how you would figure that out. The Apiary Inspectors of America suggest treating for mites at a 3% infestation level. They're actually talking about lowering that to 1% because that's how bad the viruses have gotten on the mainland. Now here in Hawaii, we actually see that our bees are able to tolerate higher loads. So anywhere from like 5 to 10%. So you can maybe go a little bit higher here. Like I would not let it get to 10%, but if you're at 5, you could maybe let it go instead of 3, maybe let it go to 5% before treating. And we have a number of treatment options available. We have 9 products registered for use in Hawaii. 6 of them are organic. Yeah, 3 are conventional. What I tell anybody is that you have to treat for the mites, however you choose to do it. We have organic products and we have conventional products. Neither of them are overtly bad for your bees if you follow the label and you use them at the appropriate time of the year. And even though it's an organic product, there's still certain times of year where you cannot harvest the honey after you have treated with that product. So that's why I say read the label, because organic does not inherently mean safe for any potential products that are going to be harvested. And it doesn't mean that it's any less deadly to the mite, right? So just always read the label, but whatever your, paradigm for beekeeping is, there are products available to support you.
That's good. Yeah. It's important to remember. And for folks that want to get started in beekeeping, to understand those type of risk and things that you need to manage and look for to make sure that your colony is staying healthy and whatnot. So
And some people think too, like they can let it go. They don't test for mites and then they're like, but my colony is really strong. It doesn't matter. I'm like, well, if your colony is really strong, there's going to be a delay. You all of a sudden you have a bunch of adults emerge. Well, potentially you're now going to have a bunch of larvae in there as well once your queen ramps up. And that's where the mites are going to be developing. And so at some point it's going to fall back. I mean, I've seen colonies before you have like 25%. So 75 mites get counted in a shake. I mean, that's insane. It's not going to happen overnight, but your bees are all going to die and they're going to have a lot of viruses in them when that happens. So, just because the colony looks productive, it doesn't mean it's healthy.
Yeah, and I'm sure having more mites in there, like you said, is just going to make their health,
decline in the long term.
Yeah, and set them up to be set up for other types of viruses or bacteria, the Falibro that could come in, right? So important to recognize a healthy colony if you're going to start beekeeping. Well, gosh, we talked so much about management practices for bee, but so maybe share with us some of the projects and things that you're working on now, Chrissy. I mean, you shared so much information about beekeeping management, but what are you folks working on right now?
So I've got 2 graduate students right now. One is working on a project on how the nutrition that's available in the environment. So we're dealing with specifically in leeward areas. So we've got apiaries on Oahu and on Maui. So in a Kiawe dominant system, how does pollen availability and nutrition affect overall colony health on a Varroa positive and a Varroa negative location? Yeah, so just kind of trying to see, overall what the forage that's available right now in the environment, how nutritious is that? And then what kind of benefits does that nutrition then pass along to the bees? So he's going to be finishing up with all of that in December, that work. And then I have a new student who just started this winter. And she is actually, I'm really excited about both of their projects, but I'm excited about her project because it's a lot of things I keep talking about, like what do bees feed on? So she's gonna be building off of the work that Daniel has done. So he's been collecting pollen from, a location on Oahu and a location on Maui for over a year. I was collaborating with people at the Kauai Community College Apiary 2 years ago, and they sent me pollen every single month for an entire year. So we've got all of this pollen that's been collected monthly. She's now going to expand upon that and start collecting pollen from the Big Island, another location on Maui, different location on Oahu as well. And so we're going to have, examples from all over the state. And she's going to identify that pollen. Like, what is this? We're going to get in there. We're going to do the genetic work. We're going to identify it to the best of our abilities. In some areas, we might be able to, look at the pollen under a microscope and identify it that way. It's likely that we're going to be able to say, we know there's X number of distinct species, but maybe we can't necessarily put a name to that, just because, not a whole lot of genetic work has been published on plants in Hawaii, or it's only been done with like very specific native Hawaiian plants, not necessarily some of the other ones, maybe endangered plants, but not the ones that are more common. So we're going to do the best that we can, but to put names to these species, which I'm super excited about. And that's going to have, really far ranging implications. So we talked about for home growers, like, oh, what native plants can I put out there for my bees? It's going to have, big impact for the land managers. Like, where are there weeds that we should be getting into to manage? Maybe didn't think about a certain location as being particularly bad for a particular species, but now you know that it is. And the honeybees are probably a reason why it's able to propagate as well as it does, But so there's, multi-tiered things that we'll be able to do with this. And then what she's also going to do is we're going to get down to the nitty gritty of what makes it nutritious. So one of the things we talk about with pollen, that's their sole source of protein, but protein is a big word. It means a lot of things. So proteins are made up of amino acids. And for honeybees, they've just like us, they've got 10 essential amino acids. And they all have to be present in certain ratios in order for a honeybee baby to develop from egg to adult. So how does this break down? How do weeds that have been introduced, how do our introduced species, what are the amino acid ratios of those? What are the amino acid ratios of our native plants, which I mentioned, it's birds and beetles and flies are the major pollinators of those. How does that line up with what we know a honeybee actually needs? Do we see differences in the time of year? Is there some response to, weather events that are affecting the nutrition of pollen? And that's going to be really valuable information for beekeepers to understand, maybe they're always going in because like, oh, Christmas berry, that's a controversial plant to bring up, right? Because a lot of people, they want it eradicated and, they're in the process of working on biocontrol for this plant, but it's also one that the beekeepers, rely upon. Yeah. They get a honey crop off of that. But how nutritious is Christmas berry? Is it something like they're foraging on it because there's nothing else available at that time of year, but really it's not that great for them, but we don't have that information. And so being able to, answer some of those questions, I'm really excited about. So we talk a lot about management, but I'm really interested in nutrition.
That's because that's a big part of management too, right? And well, I always have people ask me too, like, what about, so, some of our invasive weeds have presylene alkaloids and things that are toxic to other livestock. So does any of those kinds of things affect bees, like when they're collecting the pollen and things like that?
Can it be toxic?
Yeah, can it be toxic to them as well?
Sometimes, and that's not an area that I'm going to be looking at specifically. So we're focusing on nutrition, not necessarily some of these other toxic compounds. But a plant isn't always going to be putting those toxic compounds into its floral tissues. Usually it's going to be putting it in its leafy tissues. And so that's why it may affect other livestock, but because it's also probably putting it there to, fend off insect herbivores. That's probably what it's trying to get to not eat it. So it's not necessarily going to have that in the flowers, although it could certainly exist in the nectar and then in the pollen. But that's something like you'd have to go on a plant by plant basis to figure that out. But I know poison ivy, the toxins that make that, so irritating to us can show up in honey. And so people can get, and honeybees visit poison ivy flowers, no problem. They don't have an issue with it, but the honey can actually be really harmful to somebody who's very allergic to poison ivy.
Yeah.
Like, we need to have you on here and talk about like honeybee nutrition again at some point in the future.
Yeah,
so that would be really cool.
Well, and that is a big part of management, right? And I guess it might be a silly question, but when you look at a honeybee, as far as its health, like what are you looking at them? Like if you were to look at, I might not know, I can tell you a healthy cow from a not healthy cow, but how would you tell a healthy bee from a non-healthy bee? Like what do you look at?
Well, it's not always easy, right? I mean, so it's okay. So what can we look for with that? All right. So the first thing, if you go into a hive, you want to see, are your adults healthy? So obvious signs of disease. The biggest one is deformed wing virus that's transmitted by the mites. You're still going to see that though on the outer islands where you don't have it, because this virus is just present in honeybee populations. Unfortunately, on the Varroa positive islands, you get kind of fixated and fixed to one very dominant and very virulent strain of it. So you have a lot more deformed wing virus diversity elsewhere. Unfortunately, on Varroa positive islands, we don't have the diversity, and the one we have is really bad. So it's like the Delta variant of COVID. You're like, dang it. I got vaccinated and now this is happening. So it's kind of the same way with deformed wing virus. So, and the reason I point that out is like, so that's one of the first things you can see. You'll go inside and you might see an adult that has one crumpled wing or two crumpled wings. That's deformed wing virus. It's an obvious sign of disease. It means that, but just because we don't see it doesn't mean the bees don't have it. Again, that just means that they had enough that they became symptomatic. You can go in and you can see, so the German bees, we call them. So it's like the German race of honeybees. They're more of a darker color. So the Italians that we see most of the time, they have an orange abdomen. The Germans are going to be mostly darker. So they can sometimes be confused. But if you see a black shiny bee, so this is one that's got no hair on its body and it's shiny, that's a sign of that's a disease. It's a different suite of, yeah, that's another suite of some of the viruses that would mean like, whoa, you're very sick. I don't see that very often here, but it's something that you could see obvious sign of infection. It's going to be the brood, right? I mentioned for the foul brood, they get very smelly. They can liquefy, they're brown. So that's foul brood. There's different types of fungal infections. So Ascophera, chalk brood is very common, especially in wet areas, especially in wet times of year. Sometimes people get worried about that. It's a fungal infection and it causes your bees to basically turn into these, like the larvae turn into these like little mummies. And then the adults will just like, the nurse bees will just kind of throw them away. So you may see some on the outside of your colony with all the other trash that the bees, pick out and throw away. And that's okay. It's never, this is never going to kill a colony. If you think that killed the colony, it didn't. They were already sick with something else, and then that was also there. So chalk brood disease is another one that you can see evidence of, although it's like relatively minor. Again, like the Varroa mites, you can sometimes see the adults on, but you shouldn't do visual as a means of quantifying or even presence absence, because that's not the best. Let's see what else is there. Oh, signs of diarrhea. It happens to the best of us. Dysentery in honeybees is a thing, and that's going to be caused by, nocemosis is going to cause that. So for the most part, bees do not poop inside the hive because that's dirty. That's where they sleep. So they're going to fly outside to do that. But so if you see a bunch of, kind of fecal spots on the outside of your colony, then that's, evidence that you may have an Oceama infection. Now, that's an infection that we actually see we have really high levels. We're in like the 90th percentile. If you look at Hawaii's levels of Nosema compared to the rest of the nation, I don't know why that is, but there's nothing you can do about it except keep your bees healthy. So it's like, well, that sucks. But if you see inside of your colony, you've got a really bad Nosema infection, and you really need to evaluate, what kind of resources they have available, nectar and pollen, and probably get them on a really strict feeding schedule to make sure that they can kind of overcome that. So that's how you would tell if your bees are healthy or not. But then also, is your colony growing? If your colony doesn't grow, it's because your adults are dying, or something is wrong with your queen as well. So certain times a year, the colony is going to shrink and get smaller. That's okay. So during the winter months, even though we don't have a real winter, their biological clocks tell them like it's time to slow down a little bit, and they're going to slow down. And then, during the spring is when they really ramp up. So, different times of year, you'll see that. And it's important. It's an art as much as it is a science to keep bees, and we've got so many different microclimates here in Hawaii. So it's hard to tell someone what exactly they should be seeing at any given time of the year, because it's going to depend on their location. And so it's trial and error. It's speaking with other beekeepers in your area, and it's learning not just from what worked for them, but for what didn't work from them, like learning from people's failures as well as their successes.
Is there a specific area that you should have if you want to start a colony? Like, do they need a specific space? Like if if you have too many neighbors with different colonies and they're too close together, does that impact them? Like, do you need an acre? Do you need,
Hard saying, not knowing,
Like
right?
in a
It just, I think
suburb,
it
yeah,
depends.
like I've heard of suburban beekeepers on the mainland, but like,
Yeah, I mean, do they
So
have
I-
a range that they normally
yeah.
you want to be in with it to be able to have your own hive, stay in your own colony, I guess to say, right?
Yeah, so that's going to depend on what's flowering in your area and how frequently and how much of it, right? So, I mean, stocking densities, again, it kind of is a trial and error thing, especially because we have no beekeeper registries. We don't know how many colonies we have in the state. We don't know where they are in the state either. So to get at that information, you know, joining local beekeeping organizations. Big Island has the biggest and the most active one in the state.
Because that's the one I
it's
did
my
the honey
hope.
judge contest for, and I was like, it's so much fun. I
Yeah.
fully recommend it to anybody.
Yeah. No, they're awesome. It's such a great
Yeah.
group of people, you know, and Kauai, I know that they have a group. I don't believe Maui has anything. So, you know, being able to, you know, connect locally with your neighbors that are also beekeepers is really important. And I strongly encourage that type of, you know, grassroots organization, because if you have a group of people, you can bring in experts, you know, they can zoom in, they can come fly out and
I
visit
think
you. And
that a
then
couple
help
of the
you.
organizations do some of that. I think you'd probably be more
Mhm.
familiar with that than I would, but I know they. I mean,
I've done a lot with Biba. Yeah. Biba, and then also the KCC Apiary on Kauai as well. So yeah, absolutely. I mean, I really encourage that because we also have no statewide beekeeping
I didn't realize
association,
that.
unfortunately. So no, I know, right? We do not. So, you know, being able to get, you know, people together and organizing at various levels, that's a great way to get information from your neighbors and from other beekeepers. Like that is
Well, and if
really,
someone was
really
interested in
important.
going into it too,
Yeah.
I mean, that's kind of, I think Biba does like an entire, like, if you want to get into it kind of, I thought they had some information or something. I think they had some at one point. Again,
Yeah.
I feel like I have to give the caveat with a lot of things pre-COVID. I was like, they used to have, I want to say like
Yeah.
informational
They used
sessions
to.
for people interested. Oh,
Yeah.
they did. Okay. Interested in getting into beekeeping. and stuff.
Whether how active some of those things are now, you'd have to actually see, right? Because
Yeah.
COVID just changed a lot of those little organizations and how they had to be able to do
Do
things. But
things.
I must
Yeah.
say it's funny that you say stocking density because you only hear that with like cattle and whatnot. And now you think about it with bees. I mean, that's
It makes
kind
a
of
lot
what
of
it
sense,
is, right?
though. Yeah.
Right. Because you don't want to have too many. And yeah, anyways, that can lead to other issues, right? So
Mhm.
Absolutely. And they can fly far. They can go 3 kilometers away from a colony to search for food. And then they'll recruit, right? So if you go out there, you find stuff, you're like, this is so good. There's a ton of it. I'm going to taste some and I'm going to bring it back. So now you've got 4 sisters when you just, you know, flew back and you're going to dance. You're going to tell them where it was. Like that dance gives information on how far away it is and what direction to fly to find it. They're going to know what this smells like and what it tastes like because she's bringing back some of the pollen on her body that can be smelled and tasted. She's going to regurgitate some of that nectar. And they're like, this is awesome. Well, now 5 bees are going to fly back to that same location.
Yeah.
And then 5 bees are going to come back and they're going to do the same dance and recruit now 25 bees next time. So it's that type of like mass recruitment that they're able to do, which is what makes them so, even if they're not the most efficient pollinator, there's a lot of them. And so they get the job done,
Right.
you know, well enough. Right. And so, but they can do 3 kilometers. They can go even further. They can go 15 kilometers if they have to.
So the key is
They can
to
go
have
really
stuff
far.
nearby that they want to have in order to keep them in your own little space. In other words,
Right. And I refer to that as the bed and breakfast approach, right? It's not enough to just have a space for
Right.
them. Like they have to have something to eat. And so if you've got acreage, you know, being able to plant pollinator mixes, a lot of flowering plant species that are good for cattle are also great for bees, you know, because I mean, again, like there's coming from, you know, Europe. So a lot of those same species, you know, not necessarily
Right.
native to here, but
I mean, Calvi
Nice-
is a
nice
perfect
species.
example, right? Because their whole connection to the livestock, and that's why they were the connection to the bees
Exactly.
and everything. So yeah.
Able to establish.
Yeah.
and that's an option. Shoot, there was one more thing. Oh, dang it. Might be in my mind, right? There's one more thing I was going to say that had to do with like the stocking densities, but now it's slipping.
Not a problem. But that's funny. Yeah, it's funny because there's so many terms I think that are very related. Go ahead, you remembered.
I did remember now. So you mentioned like suburban beekeeping. That's a big deal on the mainland. Okay, you have to look up your county ordinance. And I have this on my website. It's county by county that beekeeping in areas that are zoned for anything other than agriculture is allowed. Only Honolulu County, only on Oahu can you keep bees in an urban or suburban area. The rest of the islands, you've got to know where you're at. The other islands, it has to be zoned agriculture. or else you cannot keep bees. It's not allowed use of the land. And then there's going to be restrictions on how far away from roadways and neighboring properties you have to be so they don't become a nuisance. So at the county level, they're actually regulated as livestock, but also as nuisance pests or nuisance animals, like chickens and roosters. That's kind of where you can find that in the county code.
It's a huge thing. So I'm sure at some point we'll do like a
we will definitely have to do that, because that was one of the things I think I recommended to people too that wanted to start poultry, was always check your county ordinance, because and if you're in a HOA, that's another place that you have to check, because some of them, even though it's allowed in your county, your HOA might not allow it. So and you.
And I will say the Big Island, BIBA's done a great job. And so they're in the process of, well, they were pre-COVID, but they're in the process of redoing their ordinances so that you can have backyard beekeepers on the Big Island. So they're moving towards that there, which is wonderful.
Tons of subdivisions around that, not necessarily like outside of Hilo and like Ona and stuff. So I was like,
that's right. Yeah, and it's important, I think. Wow. Oh my gosh. Thank you so much.
Yes. Thank you,
Chrissy, for joining us today and sharing so much information about bees. I mean, I remember the workshop was so good, but I felt like it was still limited. Like I felt like there was still a lot more to learn from that. So thank you so much for joining us today on our Livestock Wala'au podcast.
Yes, thank you. Do you have anything like coming up that you want to like plug or tell people about, or?
No.
I was like,
I do not, because COVID.
Yeah.
No, I mean, stay tuned. So it's my hope that Varroa workshops will be able to happen statewide. We're similar to what we did last February pre-COVID. We can get into the hives and, so the last workshop that it was actually Janae O'Dani organized that. And I kind of went along as her sidekick, but that was like meant to be focused on foul brood and training veterinarians on what to notice so that they can write prescriptions. In this case, the focus would be on monitoring for Varroa. The treatment options available. This would happen on Varroa positive and negative islands. I think that's what's most important. We assume it's not on these negative islands, but getting people to monitor. So we've applied for funding for that. So we'll see if that comes through. But beekeepers are a very underserved agricultural group in the state. And so I'm hoping that that'll help to address that. Yeah, there's tend to be a lot smaller scale. And so because, unfortunately, groups just aren't as well organized. Again, major exception being BIBA. I think, their lobbying potential isn't as great as it could be to pass, laws and regulations that would really help support them as an industry.
Which is kind of a shame, because these are really important to like just the ecology and the environment of agriculture in general. So definitely. And we don't give them enough credit that they deserve for all the work that they contribute to the industry, to the livestock industry. So well, thank you again so much for joining us. We hope to have you back, I'm sure. Talk
more about bee nutrition, and maybe follow up with your projects that you guys are, once you guys have gotten more information. That'd be really cool to hear an update about those. But thank you, Dr. Mogren, for joining our Livestock Wala'au podcast today. We sure don't give our little bee friends enough credit for all the work they contribute to the industry.
And make sure to join the Facebook page, the Livestock Extension Group, if you haven't already. Be sure to visit the CTAHR Extension website and our YouTube channel listed in the show notes.
And for additional information about this topic, you can see Dr. Mogren's page, Mālama Pua, website listed in the show notes of the podcast and the description box of our YouTube page. Thanks again, everyone, for listening to the Livestock Wala'au.
Before we go, show some love for your favorite podcast. That's us, by the way, by leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts and anywhere else this podcast is available. Then stay tuned for next month's podcast.
Ahui ho, everybody. Until next time.
Bye.